Hello summer, goodbye. Science fiction in the summertime, particularly English science fiction, is a great delight. Obviously, if you're not English, you're not British, I'm not English, I'm Welsh, you might have a different take on this. So this is my summer science fiction reading, and I've turned to authors who I feel particularly conjure up landscapes, particularly the English landscape, very well. And these are the people who I turn to for that sort of great comfort reading, but nonetheless with a challenge that you get from all truly great SFs. So we're going to look at 10 books. This isn't a ranked list. I am going to mention some people who I love to read in the summertime who are not British, who loom large, and they are Ray Bradbury. We did a Ray Bradbury video on the channel recently. Obviously Ray wrote an awful lot with a summery feel, and his stuff is just sublime. And I want to come back to that because the books I would have talked about I want to speak of in a different context. So we're here in a lovely Wiltshire garden today, and we're going to talk about some British SF particularly. Somebody else I should really mention who I read a lot in the summer, and I'm waiting for some new books by her to arrive. I say new books, they're not new books, they're books by her I haven't read, is Chelsea Quinn-Yarborough, who is often quite dark, but who I've always really enjoyed in the summertime because her prose is so absolutely fine. So is this a parochial list? No, it's a specific one, is what I would say. Is it cosy? To a degree, but it has a shadowy heart, as all great SF does. Is it literary? It is, boldly and proudly so, but at the same time I've tried to pick things which are readable, which have very fine prose that rolls over the eyeballs, that instantly evokes the summer and the countryside to you wherever you are. So this is a particularly English summer, so cheers. I'm going to begin with an author who always I turn to in summer, and who always makes me think of summer, with the possible exception of one book, Friends Come in Boxes, which Brian Aldiss described as his toughest read. But the book I'm going to turn to first of all is a wonderful, wonderful summer book, and that's Hello Summer, Goodbye by Michael Coney, Michael Greatorex Coney. This is the Panther Edition. There we go, isn't that beautiful? And this is a fairly recent PS hardcover, because when this came out, this was 10 or 15 years ago, PS discovered there was an unpublished sequel to this book called I Remember Palahaxi, and that was issued with this in a slipcase set, and I still got that. I'm actually going to sell this one on because I do have a Golanchy Yellow Jacket first edition. So Michael Coney, let's tell you a bit about him first of all. He was British. He travelled around a lot, and he was a busy man. He was basically a hotelier and publican. He lived in Antigua in Canada. He ran pubs and hotels in these places. He ran pubs in the West Country, in the west of England, which is where we are today. And this book by him, Hello Summer, Goodbye, was published by Door in the US as Rax, which isn't such a good title, and obviously it's a more hardcore, skiffy sounding title. But Hello Summer, Goodbye, to me, conjures up the particular poetry, and there are leaves on the table here, you can hear the leaves crinkle, of Coney's work. And basically reading Michael G. Coney is almost like going on a summer holiday, a beach holiday, a particularly British beach holiday. And this is fundamentally the story of an adolescent going on a protracted holiday in the summer to a fishing village. It sort of stands in for Cornwall, really. It's on an alien planet, and the narrator and his people, they're humanoids, but there's no sort of suggestion they're from Earth. And he, every summer, will go back and stay in this place by the coast. And he's a young man, he's an adolescent, as I say, and he's got a bit of a yearning for a young woman he met called Palahaxi Brown Eyes. And people's names in this culture are based on where they come from. So Palahaxi is the place. And the reason the novel is called Rax in America is because the planet is part of a double system with a large planet called Rax, which is nearby. So it has an elliptical orbit around its star, and what this means is that it has very, very intense, hot, long summers, and then very, very, very harsh winters. So it's a book about the changing of the seasons and the joy of summer. It's a book that's full of sentiment, nostalgia, longing, and the culture that's depicted is fairly sort of low tech. And this young man, he's a little bit of an outside. He's not getting on very well with his parents. He's trying to fit in with other kids. And there is a civil war going on in the background. There's a certain amount of political situations, but he goes back to this place in the summer and he wants to sort of meet up with this beautiful young woman. And it's a very charming book. It's very wistful. It's sweet, yet it's astringent at its edges. And as I say, there's one sequel. I can only say that the plot is secondary, I feel, to the feel, but you know, it has the interesting astronomical stuff. It's got some really sort of interesting alien life forms which are well depicted. There are sailing scenes in which those come into play, and you've got the ship there on the cover, which gives you an idea. So this is really a bit like, if you're not from the UK, you've never experienced it, reading this book is a little like going on holiday to Devon and Cornwall. And if you're from a non-British culture, the exoticism comes through that you would experience if you went to those places, comes through in the way this book is written. So it's really beautiful. And I always turn to Coney when I want something romantic, and I mean romantic with a small r. He does have some burrs and chamfers and sharp edges, and you know, he's probably a bit tougher than people say he is, but wonderful, wonderful stuff, and very gentle and elegiac, and it makes you look back at your youth, and also it's something which advises you to enjoy your youth. It's really important stuff. So that's Hello Summer, Goodbye by Michael Coney. He changed in later his career. He did work which seemed more fantasy orientated as he got into the 80s, and he was reasonably prolific, won a few awards, but was never as big as he should have been. And some people say he's a lightweight, but there is a certain skill at depicting a light story, and that's going to come up several times in this video. Someone in a similar vein, though probably better in a purely literary sense, is Richard Cowper. I call him Richard Cowper. The correct pronunciation is Cooper. I call him Cowper just so that you can get the spelling right, C-O-W-P-E-R. And Richard Cowper was from a literary family. His real name was Colin Murray. He was the son of John Middleton Murray, who knew Catherine Mansfield, important literary figures in the early part of the century. They were very friendly with D.H. Lawrence. So he's from that sort of background, and he wrote some mainstream novels as Colin Murray. And he wrote a story in the mid-70s called The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Now, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, you know, is a Pink Floyd album, the first one. It's also a quotation from The Wind in the Willows, and it's from the section of Wind in the Willows which is quite pagan, that depicts the animals coming across Pan, the god of panic, the faun, in the middle of the forest. And it's about the sort of beauty and heathen nature and of the British woodland. So that's an interesting thing he did that, and it's the first. This story is kind of a prelude to the books which follow, and it's in this book which is called The Custodians, and it's never been collected with the other three books, and I don't think there's ever been an omnibus volume, because this is a trilogy we're talking about, and the first of them is called The Road to Corley, and here it is again in a pan lozenge, and this comes from 1978, and Road to Corley was sort of repackaged in the 80s. It's two sequels, and it was repackaged by Orbit to make them look like fantasy novels. And it was one of those things where you felt they were kind of trying to sell them, you know, they were trying to sell basically what were great sort of post-apocalyptic novels by disguising them as fantasy. And they were very attractive covers, and I tried to try and pick them up one day. And Corley came out in 1978, and there it is, say, in Pan, and is set in the year 3000 AD, and Britain is flooded due to constant rain. So it's the hint of global warming there already. And instead of being just one big island anymore, Britain is sort of reduced to like an archipelago, because all the low places have been flooded. So there's different islands and people travel between them. And it's quite an austere book in lots of ways. It's almost like a milder hybrid of Christopher Priest and Keith Roberts. And the thing I would say about Cowper is that the one thing that really characterises him is that he was quite mild and gentle, and I think sometimes too much so. I sometimes wish he'd have been a bit more hard-edged, but he was a real craftsman, and this is a very finely told and fleet tale. So the background to this is that Britain in that flooded future has been kind of overtaken by a fundamentalist Christian religion, this sort of bully boys in the church and what have you. And you can see a bit of an influence of Keith Roberts' Pavan over that. And what happens is there's a young boy who has this vision of a white bird of kinship, and he wants to promote a more gentle spirituality, and people follow him and they become oppressed and they're heretical. So that's the sort of basis of the story. But there is another thread, this contemporary thread, which is set now, and it's about people working in a laboratory doing psi research, and they're projecting their minds into the future to view what's going to happen. And that was quite a common gambit in British SF in the 60s and 70s. You get a similar thing in Bob Shaw's book Dagger of the Mind, and you also get it in Gary Kilworth's Split Second, where there's these two sort of narrative threads and they interweave and one becomes the other. So this is a great read if you like things like Pavan, if you like very stately, measured, well-written things which have partially the feel of an historical novel, because in these the future resembles the past, and there's a lot in it about Britain being an island and what happens to islands and how they can become hidebound to certain beliefs and practices. So that's pretty interesting stuff. I say there are two sequels, which are A Dream of Kinship and A Tapestry of Time, and the precursor is called Piper of the Gates of Dawn, and it's in this book, The Custodians. And that's a Gollancz Yellow Jacket first. I do have a first of this as well, but I wanted to show you that today, and I'm going to do a Gollancz Yellow Jackets firsts video at some time soon. So that's one to watch out for, The Road to Calais. Lovely stuff, very measured and carefully done. Which is the mark of British SF, is the quality of the writing. Some of the sort of lesser stuff can be less exciting, and it was interesting, I was watching that lovely chap on Science Fiction Reads, and he was saying he didn't enjoy The Furies by Keith Roberts, and I suspect it was because I'd suggested in one of my videos that it was kind of Wyndham-esque, and it is, but the thing to remember is that Wyndham obviously was very gentle and literary, and very often the people inspired by him, and that was pretty much every British SF writer for decades, was inspired by Wyndham, more so than Clarke, I would say. They all loved him, but they were all kind of reacting against him, so you get these different takes. The catastrophe novels and the summary novels by British SF writers, which are not so good, are the people who try to imitate him too much and who just haven't got the skill with the prose and the characterization that Wyndham had. So these are quite Wyndham-esque novels, a lot of them. With that in mind, let's talk about Wyndham himself, and we'll move on. Isn't it lovely out here? This is a friend's garden. It's great, isn't it? She's given me a beer as well. Fantastic. This is John Wyndham. This is Chalky, here in the beautiful NYRB edition from the USA. You can't buy this in the UK. I had to get mine on import. I've got my original Chalky is a really old penguin I bought in about 1973 or 74, and that's really nice. It's the nicest edition Chalky I've ever seen. It's got an introduction by Margaret Atwood, which I don't really approve of, because I don't think she's the right person. They could have got somebody like M. John or CP or what have you, one of the British sort of guys to do it. But it's not bad, you know, it is good. Let me just try and get that up there on the podium, as we say. And this was the last novel by Wyndham that was published during his lifetime. There was one afterwards. Well, there's been a few things, and there is an obscure John Wyndham video coming up on the channel soon where I talk about Wyndham, and I've got some insider information because I know somebody in the Wyndham family. And as I say, it was the last one published in his lifetime, and a book after this was actually rejected, and he died quite young, of course, in the late 60s. And again, this is very much like a school holidays feel to it. Is it a children's book? The narrator is a father, the central character is Matthew, a young boy, and it does have a kind of classic adventure story setting, a summer holiday film feel, and some of it is actually set during children's summer holiday, particularly important incident towards the end of the book. And this is about a young chap called Matthew, as I say, and Matthew seems to have an invisible friend. Now, that's not unusual in children of a certain age. It probably is more so now. It was more common when I was younger. But his parents start to notice that there's something very, very odd going on, because the questions which are being asked, the questions that they can't hear, and the questions that the boys are relating to his father once it comes out, are things like, why are there two sexes, and why doesn't your car have an engine that stops it as well as starts it, and stuff like that. So some quite interesting stuff. So there is a hint of possession in this, and the parents start to get quite worried. And in that respect, it reminds me of Nigel Neal, where a lot of people say about Nigel Neal, he would write SF narratives, but they would have the feel of horror, and they would have that hint of the demonic and, you know, the eldritch and the infernal. So there is a little reference to that. It's also a first contact novel, and what's great about it is that it is so English. It's very easy to read, it's very short and sharp, and it just has all the wonderful British virtues. And Wyndham, of course, was the cosy catastrophist, as Aldous called him, but there was a dark hardcore. But this is one of his gentlest books, I would say, and I'd recommend it to anybody. There was a TV series of it, I think in the early 80s or late 70s. I was sort of grown up by then. I didn't think a lot of the series. This is actually much, much better. And it covers all sorts of topics, from childcare to the origin of artistic flair, and where does inspiration come from? Does it come from outside the human being? Is it something we can access? It is middle class, it's safe, but as Christopher Priest said, it's sort of odd, disturbing and remarkable, rather than fantastic and horrifying. And it's a wonderful story because it's also a coming of age story, and there's a marvellous sequence when the narrator of the story, the father, makes contact with the alien being, which is just absolutely superb. So that's one of the more obscure Wyndhams. I mean, all Wyndham's books are famous. All the ones that were published during his lifetime under his name are. There were a few others, but we'll come to them at a different time. So this is Chalky. Get this edition if you can. Current Penguin editions are just horrible. They're making no effort. And of course, there's loads of second-hand ones out there. Loads and loads and loads. So we move on. I hope you're enjoying the summer. I know I certainly am. It's nice to have some fine weather at last. We move on then to my favourite living writer. No surprises there, because this is a book which I think is superb, one of his best, and this is Christopher Priest, and it is The Quiet Woman. Originally, this book was going to be called Explanations. That's something Chris told me himself one day in Pewsey, way back in 88, 89, when he was living in Pewsey, and the book is set in Pewsey, or at least somewhere that very closely resembles it. When we did the second interview a while ago, we talked about what was his lost novel, and we both feel it's this one. And that's probably because it was published by Bloomsbury, only did one book with them, and it sort of fizzled out really. But for me, it marked the end of his finest decade stylistically as a novelist, and it was a real step forward. And it came out in 1990, even though it was written in the 80s, and it is very much an 80s novel, but you know the way that the decades blend into each other. So it's set in a small town like Pewsey in Wiltshire, which is a really nice town. You'll have seen I'm doing some sort of out and abouts, which I filmed. You might not have seen me yet, but they'll be coming up soon in some of the lovely towns in this sort of neck of the woods in Wiltshire and Somerset, and hopefully soon in Dorset as well. And the town is on the main line to London, and there's a woman living there called Alice Stockton, and Alice is a biographer. She writes biographies, and she's masterfully realised she's a female protagonist. She is the sort of linchpin of everything, and the way the Priest depicts her is just absolutely fantastic. You know, this thing about can men write women and vice versa, you know, they can. Often it's not quite authentic to the particular gender that's being depicted, but I felt he did a magnificent job in this, really good. And in the background, there's been a nuclear accident in France. It's near future, as they say, and there is fallout that could possibly blow across the channel. Everybody's worried. It all depends on the weather, as everything does in the summer. Nobody really knows the way it's going to go, so that's looming in the background. And Britain has developed a quietly repressive government, and what Priest said is that this was reflective of Thatcher. It was his anti-Thatcher novel, and very much at that time there was a lot of feeling that Thatcherism had changed the country, and it hasn't changed back, and it really did change things, and it's a very divisive time. And Alice grows interested in a woman who lived in the village who's murdered, and this woman used to be a children's writer years and years before, and Alice decides she's going to write a biography of her. And this doesn't seem like a very commercial proposition, so there is a concern around that. But she starts to investigate the murder and what's happened, and she ends up coming into conflict with the murdered woman's son, Gordon, and he works for the government, and they have a new thing in place where when writers write books, before they're submitted to the publishers as professional writers, the government has to read them, and sometimes they buy the manuscripts, pay the authors, and just file them. So it's a kind of paid censorship, and she's really concerned about this happening to her work. Also, it would reduce her royalties and income. So it's quite a book about writers and writing and storytelling. And it is really quite something, because some very strange things happen, and you tread that line that you always do with Priest about what is real and what isn't, what's actually happening and what is actually in the heads of one of the characters or not. It was an age of crop circles, of political conservatism, and it's written with the most plangent style. It's assured. The plotting is the usual Gordian knot you get with Priest, simpler than usual, but still quite surprising. You are taken aback at times, and for me this closed his finest decade as a novel, you know, and it's unashamedly sophisticated. The Quiet Woman, fantastic book. So if you're reading through his work chronologically, which I do advise because that's the best way to explore it, discover it, and see how he grows as a writer, after you've read The Affirmation and The Glamour, move on to The Quiet Woman. And this is the current Gollancz edition. Absolutely fantastic. A subtle, brilliant, rural SF novel. And there are some scenes in London, and there's cats in it as well. So there you go. What can you say? Good stuff, eh? Next, somebody who I've talked about quite a bit on the channel recently, and I've been rereading his early work. In theory, I'm going to do a video about his SF work, because he's somebody who moved on into other things, still does the odd bit now and again, but he began his career as an SF writer, and he's somebody who I think really is neglected and did some really good work, and he's still out there, and that's Gary Kilworth. And this is In Solitary, his first novel, which is from I think 77 or 78, and let's just have a look, because I've got the hardcover first here as well. This was published by Faber, and at that time Gary was published by Faber alongside Christopher Priest and Robert Holdstock. Roger Zelazny was Faber, Aldis had been Faber, you know, so they were quite an important SF publisher then, which doesn't really get mentioned very much these days, as they did stop doing SF after a while. So this is In Solitary, and In Solitary is probably his first novel, apart from The Night of Kadar, his second novel, which I talked about a while ago. This is probably my favourite early novel by him. He won the Gollancz Sunday Times SF Prize in 1975. He was an RAF signaller for many years. Then when he retired, he started to write. And he was a well-travelled guy. He travelled a lot as a kid as well. His parents travelled a lot. And as a result of that, he's consequently very adept at depicting exotic settings, or settings which would be exotic to those of us from the West or from Britain. You know, he's sort of really good at that, and there's a lot of that in his work, and I absolutely love it. He's great at that. He's really good. You could call him a bit like Ray Bradbury. He's like the Ray Bradbury of the English marshes, the Fenlands, East Anglia, where he still lives now, and he does spend some time in Spain as well, I believe. So he's a great guy. I met him once, did an event with him once, and hopefully I'll get to meet him again one day, because he's a lovely chap. So what is In Solitary about? In Solitary is set couple of hundred years in the future, and Earth has been invaded by beings called the Soul, and the Soul are quite small. They're smaller than people. They are a bit like flying foxes, fruit bats, or sugar gliders, you know, like a flying squirrel. They have a patagium. They have that skin, a flap of skin from their wrist down to their ankle. That's what it's called. It's called a patagium, one of my favourite words. Very hard to drop into the conversation, but I always try. And the Soul have invaded Earth, and the details of the invasion are unclear, because they've been in charge for quite a long time, and all the time in this is reckoned in months, so you've really got to do the math to work it out, as they say. So it's quite funny. And they've obviously done some things which have changed some climate in some areas, like around Britain. The North Sea seems to have gone, and it's all mud flats instead, so Doggerland's kind of back. And this is partially set there, but mostly set in Oceania, in Polynesia, Melanesia, Micronesia, in the southern Pacific, in other words. And Gary was stationed there at one point, and he really gets across the feel of the sort of merciless sun, the endless blue of the sky and the sea, and there's characters in outrigger canoes and stuff. Fantastic. And he did return to that in his trilogy of novels from the 90s, which are fantasy novels, the Roof of Voyaging series, which I've never read. I must pick them up. Because for a long time he moved away from this sort of genre fiction after the end of the 1980s. But yeah, the Soul have come from this other planet. They've conquered Earth. They seem to have reduced the population, and there is this argument going on amongst them about whether they need to commit genocide. It's all being done quite subtly because they have human slaves and things like that. And there are two main characters. That was a peacock you heard in the background then, by the way. And the two main characters, Cave is from the UK, and he has one friend amongst the Soul. And there's another character whose narrative opens at the beginning of the book, out in Oceania, and his name is with a T. I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. I'll give it a go. Let's just see. And Tangier, and he has an outrigger canoe, and he lives on his own on a small island. And in this, men have to be kept separated from other men, because the Soul realise that when men get together, they form war parties, and it all gets very, 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 dangerous. So they're kept apart. So there's the Soul law. Women are allowed to be together, but not men. Men are only allowed to come together with women about once every 2.5 years for mating, and they've kind of degenerated and have become quite primitive. So it's one of those things where, the Earth's been conquered and the population has been pushed down and the tech's been taken away from them and it's been reduced. So it's a very interesting situation, and that allows Kilworth to depict this incredibly sort of sunny Polynesian world, which is fantastic. The two male characters in this become friends and also rivals, and there's a certain amount of rivalry around women and what have you, because the sexuality part of it is quite important, but there's nothing massively explicit about it, but it is an important part of the narrative and the hot, sweaty, salty, oceanic feel of the book. And they form part of a resistance, and it's very fast-paced, and there's some very interesting plot twists and turns, and it's got such a wonderfully skillful, evoked sense of place, which is why I like to read it in the summer. There are sinewy surprises and vertiginous plot twists, and isn't that a great cover? And that does kind of sum it up, because this resistance against the Soul, who have all sorts of weapons and mini flying saucers and stuff, is not going to be an easy one. So it's a great example of a traditional SF invasion narrative, but executed with such originality and flair and verve that is Kilworth's own. And this is what good British SF writers are particularly great at. They take a situation which seems non-speculative, which seems non-sci-fi, and they just insert those elements and they pull it into another world. And that's what I really love, and I think that's something that Wyndham was pretty good at, and that's Wyndham's influence with people like Ballard, Priest, Roberts, all these people and lots of others. And that's why these authors were taken up so much by British readers, because they could relate to the situations and they seemed like real world things, and I think that's quite important. So to show you close up, that's In Solitary by Gary Kilworth. Great title, well worth looking out, fantastic debut. Then we move on to somebody who was British but was anything but traditional, and he was the greatest of them all. He was only British by default because he was born in the Far East, and you probably know what I'm talking about. He was born in China, didn't get to Britain until he was about 15, and by that point Britain was definitely the alien planet. And we're very much talking about J.G. Ballard. This is a hardcover signed first edition in Jonathan Cape of the very wonderful The Unlimited Dream Company. And if you can see that cover there, that's a condor on a line of swings in a children's park, and I got this in Hay on Wye, I think, for about £5. It's a Cape file copy, really, really nice, and JG signed it for me himself in the early 90s. Fantastic stuff. The Unlimited Dream Company, strictly speaking, is a fantasy novel, and it was written in 1979, published in 79, and it comes from that period where Ballard had done his disaster tetralogy, done lots of great short stories. Coming into the 70s, he did the urban trilogy of Crash, High Rise, and Concrete Island, and then it was a question of where does he go next. And it was an uncertain time in SF. We were sort of waiting for the next revolution. You know, we'd had the golden age, the social science of the 50s, the new wave, and what was going to come next. And there was a long period where the literary intensity of the new wave was melding with traditional harder SF forms, and it was an uncertain time. And Ballard was experimenting. You know, he did a book called Hello America a little before this, which seemed to be stepping back a little, but at the same time was full of his obsessions about America and its symbolism and commercialism. So this one came at the very end of 79. Wait, we're back inside. So what happened there, Steve, I hear you ask? Well, that's a typical example of what happens when you mess with J.G. Ballard. And it's also what happens in SF, because its technology and nature don't always mix. And what was happening there was my camera got really hot and it decided to click off. Halfway through, I was delivering my missive on the great Unlimited Dream Company. So we'll go back to that in a moment. That didn't even happen to me in Capri last week. It shows how hot it was in that garden. But we will go back outside, don't you worry. So I've had to film an insert. So let's sort of plunge on. Yes, this isn't the perfect YouTube standard, but that's not why you come to this channel. You come here for content. So back to the content. What was I saying? Unlimited Dream Company is actually more of a fantasy novel than anything else. And it's the sort of literary fantasy that you get from Borges or Calvino, but really it's more like a surrealist novel. I've read all the novels by the great surrealist painters, and most of them did a novel or three, mostly just one. And Ballard, of course, is always referencing the surrealists in his work, Delvaux, Ernst, Dali. He was a big fan of all those people because he was interested in the connection between surrealism and the Freudian unconscious and what have you. And as I say, when he did this book, he was experimenting, and it's about a young man who is 25 called Blake. And obviously that name has been chosen because of its implications and its references to William Blake, the great English mystic, poet, visionary. And this is very much a visionary novel. And Blake is 25 and he works in London Airport. And he's rather a sort of deviant type. He's grown up, so being pushed around a bit. He's quite aggressive. He's been quite difficult throughout his youth. He has definite criminal and antisocial tendencies and some pronounced sexual ones as well. And he has this dream of flight, of flying. And mostly he just sweeps up in the airport. And it did remind me of the disorienting airport sequences in Christopher Priest's new book, Airside. And obviously, you know, there's a big influence of Ballard over Priest. And Priest once said to me, we were talking on the phone just after the film of Empire the Sun came out. And he said, you know, Spielberg almost gets it right, he said. But, you know, the light isn't gleaming on the nacelles of the aircraft in the right way. And of course, John Williams' score is too romantic. That was my feeling. And I like Williams. But there you go. But anyway, Blake, the protagonist of this, he steals a Cessna light aircraft, flies it off, and within minutes he crashes it into the river in Shepperton, a suburb just outside London. There were film studios there. Alien was filmed there. And Shepperton, of course, is where Ballard lived, a very suburban place. But Ballard was fascinated with the mythology of suburbia, and he partially created it about what was going on behind the curtains with a strange sort of new Earth is the alien planet thing that you get in his work. And Blake is sort of quasi-rescued by a female doctor. Female doctors are a big thing in Ballard. They come up a lot in Crash and in various other novels. And females with scientific training and media backgrounds are a big thing for him, as well as the men. He was very much an equal opportunities character writer in that way. And they're often very sexy or harsh or interesting. And Miriam, Dr. Miriam, she sort of looks after Blake, but he gradually starts to develop these strange supernatural powers. He becomes quite tumescent as well, and is soon running around Shepperton, sometimes naked, and he's scattering his seed, which is profuse everywhere. And what happens from this is that all sorts of tropical birds start to appear, flamingos, toucans, condors, what have you, and lots of tropical plants flower up in the gardens and amongst the modern buildings, even in the shopping mall. And he begins to sort of create a new dreamscape in Shepperton, and the people begin to fall under Blake's spell. And in the end, he wants to teach them to fly. And it's a fantastic book, very hot and sweaty and summery and strange. And in a way, it's more like the Latin American magical realist, but at the same time, there's something so English about it because of the suburbia, because of the way that it's turned over. And you have to remember that some of the great sort of punk and rock stars in Britain came from suburbia. Susie Sue from the Banshees, David Bowie, and Suede, again, very big on suburbia. And it's the romance of that, and it's the turning of it into an exotic locale. So let's get back outside, shall we? Next up, we have Brian Aldiss, Greybeard. This is in my top 4 Aldiss novels, alongside Non-Stop, Hothouse, and Frankenstein Unbound. Those are probably my favourite ones. There's other great ones as well, but those are the 4 which stick with me and I keep going back to again and again. And this is the 7-house hardcover first thus from '93, the revised edition. It was first published in 1964. It was revised slightly a year later, and this is one of my favourite SF summer reads. The basic idea is that there's been a cosmic accident, which is called sterility in most placental mammals. And quite frankly, it makes The Children of Men by P.D. James, which came out decades later, like a melodramatic, stupid, childish book. And it kind of exposes the fact that P.D. James didn't really understand SF. She said her book wasn't SF. Well, what was it, James? What was it? And, you know, really, it's nothing compared to this. It has its moments, but this is really a very special book, and this is how to do this kind of narrative. The film of Children of Men is pretty good, actually, much better than the book, I think, even though the book is arguably subtler. But back to Greybeard. And Greybeard is the titular character. He's an old guy, and because of mass sterility, everybody's getting older, nobody's being born, and, you know, it's a bit of a problem. And the population is declining as people are dying off, the countryside is resurging, and that's where the beauty of it comes in. What people really like psychologically in the great English catastrophe novel is the countryside and the country being emptied of people, because we hate crowds. You know me, I'm a terrible misanthrope. I hate crowds. I love it when I'm on my own and you go out into the real world and it's sort of half empty. That really is my jam. So it does appeal to that. And there's a certain thing in the British psyche, because we're a small country, because we're an island, because gradually the wild and open spaces we knew are disappearing because we're an overpopulated island. The population's swelling and swelling, and we're finding it harder and harder to find that peace and quiet that we really love as a nation, as a culture, as a country. And things are changing, you know, it's changing very, very much. So this is a book which sort of goes to the core of that. And Greybeard and his wife, I think it's called Martha, they live in a little village in Oxfordshire, which is where Aldiss lived. Aldiss lived in Oxford a lot. He edited the Oxford Mail at one point, called Sparcot. And Sparcot is beautifully described, delineated and shown to us. And it's a very rustic book, and it reminds us of the tradition of the English catastrophe novel, which goes back to Richard Jefferies and also back to Mary Shelley in The Last Man. And I apologise, there's no female writers in this, but there is particularly something about British male SF writers in a particular period between the sort of Wells period, and there's lots of early catastrophe novels and landscape-based things going right the way up into the 70s, and I would like to see that come back. I love that. I think there's a lot that can be done about the environment, a lot can be said. But anyway, back to Greybeard. And Greybeard goes on a barge journey to London, so there's this little hegira through the novel, and it describes the landscape and the surviving animals. Stoats play a big part, and it's very rustic and textured. And all this, of course, was very acerbic, but, you know, he sort of echoed with tradition as well. He was somebody who would depict things in quite a literary traditional sense, and he wrote mainstream novels as well, and he's much beloved of the critics. But at the same time, that spikiness, that hard edge thing, which came in from him having experiences in World War II. He was a bookseller, so he saw the other side of the trade, as I do. And, you know, he really loved SF. He was a real devotee of it, historian. His history of SF is absolutely fantastic. And there is something happening in the woods, in the forest, besides the rivers, and there are children. they are half glimpsed, they are popping up, small beings, and it almost from what feels like a fantasy narrative, like they're elves or something of that kind, but they're feral kids. Nobody knows where they've come from or where they've been born or who's having them, but nature is finding a way. So it's a very hopeful but elegiac book, and in a way it reminds me a lot of Earth Abides. It's not as sparse and as empty as Earth Abides, and there is more of a message of hope at the end, but it is very, very much like a British Earth Abides, even though it is a book of its own. It stands alone. I wouldn't have, even though Aldous would have read Earth Abides, it is quite different because that's a plague narrative, of course. And it's full of beauty without sentiment. You can feel the twigs snapping underneath your boots. You can hear the birds singing, and there's a yearning for life as Greybeard and the characters move towards their inevitable deaths, and you know that knowledge of their passing weighs heavy on them, and it's sort of very tragic, but at the same time it is very wonderful, its acceptance of fullness of life and death. So that's Greybeard, one of Aldous's best. Cheers. Interesting, the bottle opener I use is a pelican, and there's lots of pelicans and similar birds in the Ballard book, so there you go. That wasn't chosen deliberately, it was just there, so there we go. Right, we're moving on now to more contemporary books gradually, but one more old one, because these are of a certain period, and in that period you could write these things and get away with it. Now, as I say, it's not happening so much. I'd like to see that coming back. I think there is enough of a will in the small presses, and we're seeing some more traditional English work in sort of presses like Newcon, for example, who do some great stuff. So we're going to talk about one of my it is a favourite book, but I'm divided about it at times, and this is Keith Roberts' The Chalk Giants, which I've just reread, and this is not an easy book, and I will talk about it in a Roberts video that I'm preparing, but there's an awful lot to say about it, but I'm going to talk about it today because I think it's very much a book you need to read in summer, and this is something which isn't quite as soft, should we say, or isn't quite as easy as the other books. This is a bit tougher. It's very much a book of two halves. This is the Panther edition from the mid-70s. Let's just have a look a moment, and I believe this one is signed. Let's see. Very ambitious book, 74 in Hutchinson, and this is the 75, and this is actually signed, and it's signed, if you can see that, to somebody called Mike, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's Mike Moir, who basically was the last sort of publisher. Him and Debbie, his wife, were the last publishers at Kerosena. Then they did a thing called Sirius, and they published one book by Keith called Katie and Company, which was his last hardcover book. The one after that, Lamadi from Borgo Press, was a paperback original. So it's very much a book of two halves. The first part is a catastrophe novel, a disaster novel, and it's absolutely sublime. Probably the finest single catastrophe disaster narrative I've read, but that's only the first part of the book. The second part is an evocation of topography and time, of land and history. It's a mosaic novel, so it's comprised of different stories that slot together or don't slot together, and some of them popped up in different places. And after the initial disaster sequence at the beginning, which is the most powerful part of the book, to my way of thinking, you get a story called Monkey and Prue and Sal, which is a quite strange story about a little boy in a cart in a post-apocalyptic landscape, and he's with two women, Prue and Sal, and they drive this cart along by the most interesting sort of method, and that kind of breaks the book in two, and the stories that come after that are different again. There is something, I can't say because I didn't know him, and it's only a suspicion, but I think there's something painfully autobiographical about this book. By the time Keith wrote this, he was sort of pushing 40. He was a difficult man. He didn't always get on with people. He fell out with everybody. I've mentioned this many times on the channel, and I will go into it a bit more when the Roberts video comes up, and I am working on it. It's taking time because there are multiple shooting locations. And he really sort of struggled to form relationships. I don't think he was ever married, and he was very much an outsider and a lonely guy is the impression I get. And in the opening narrative of this, it's about a guy called Stan Potts, and Stan Potts is fat, 40, balding, unattractive, nerdy. He is obsessed with machinery, with guns, and he always had a tough time at school. People always saying to him, "You must be mad, Potts, you must be mad." And there's this marvellous frame narrative where Potts has been watching the political situation and he sees that something is coming up, something is happening, and he begins to plan almost without thinking. He has an old car which is almost like an armoured sort of thing called an Austin Champ, and he begins to stockpile foods, perishables and what have you, and he realizes he's doing it the wrong way, so he goes back, spare distributor cap, all that stuff. So he's making plans for the apocalypse, because when it comes he's going to flee in this car, in this sort of semi-armored car, across the countryside. And he lives in the Midlands, and he has this unrequited love obsession with a girl who works as a barmaid in a pub at Corfe Castle in Dorset, and this closely resembles the narrative in the first part of Pavan, his most famous novel, and it's interesting comparing the two. And I wouldn't be surprised if some point whether Keith was obsessed with a young girl who was a barmaid, who he could never sort of have because he was never attractive enough or never young enough or didn't have the charm or what have you. And Potts makes his way across the countryside because this military situation is building up and there's talk about a nuclear war happening. So you get this frame narrative, this interspersed throughout the stories, of Potts driving along in his Austin Champ, and it begins with him coming up to an army roadblock and people are not allowed in a certain area, and he is literally busting for a piss. He has, his bladder is swollen, and we've all had that feeling. He desperately needs to urinate, and he takes a can and he's going to put it between his knees. And the way that's evoked, this is a painful book. Keith was very, very good at evoking pain, and I always compare him to Thomas Hardy. His work's very dark and very detailed, and the level of craftsmanship is just astonishing. You know, he really was massively acclaimed, but because he was so difficult, nobody liked working with him at publishers. He really was a difficult man. And anyway, you get this thing where this is happening, and the flashes of backstory come in, and the balloon goes up. The apocalypse begins to happen. He gets to the pub after driving cross country and having some adventures, and he's there with the object of his affection, another woman who's like a folk singer, and two other men, and they go to this little cottage in the middle of nowhere which has also been prepped, and Potts is kind of the outsider, and it goes from there. The rest of the narrative, we're uncertain whether it's in his head and what he's dreaming about, because some of the events which happen to him put him into a different sort of state of consciousness, as it were, and you're not sure if the other tales are set in the past or the future, and they could be both. Some of them could be in the past and could be the future, and the implication is that you see Britain reverting to savagery, and it all gets very Robert Holdstockian. So there's fields of wheat, there's fertility rituals, there's destiny, there's sacrifice, there's battles with swords, there's murder, it's very, very much like historical fiction. But because of this frame narrative and because of what happens at the end of it, there's this sense of cyclical time that you don't really know. Is it in Stan's head, or is it just the idea that history repeats itself, and the technological, modern, contemporary period we've lived through is something that's doomed to die and pass on, and that the countryside and the past will continue, and the man will continue, albeit in a more savage and primitive but still quite transcendent state. And that's the Chalk Giants, and absolutely fantastic. A difficult book, not essentially the best constructed book. I do prefer the early part, the later parts, but if you have a real feeling for folk horror, for Holdstock sort of stuff, which is all about the matter of Britain, for the Celtic thing, for the real sort of feel of the archaeological landscape of Britain, or of Europe generally. I mean, if you're Julian Cope, you'd love this. It really is a very impressive and challenging book, and I think if there's some of it I don't like, I think that's my fault rather than Keith's. The Chalk Giants, a difficult and challenging but nonetheless very rewarding work of absolute genius. We move on to two more contemporary writers. I hear you sigh with relief. This is Starship Summer by Eric Brown. This is the PS signed numbered limited edition, quite uncommon now. I'm not sure if there's ever been a paperback of this. Isn't that lovely? And basically, Eric Brown died recently, and he was the first of the gene rats. He was the first of the people in Interzone in the 80s, the new writers who really came through, first to get a book deal and what have you. And I always used to say, oh, you know, Eric's quite lightweight, you know, he's quite a lightweight, he's not that special. But I've read 8 books by him. I've read more books by him than any of the other gene rats, even by Colin Greenland. I think Colin Greenland's written 8 books. But I think, or has he? I'll have to check that out. Adding them at my head, I think he has, so maybe I'm lying. But you know, he wrote an awful lot. He could write all sorts of things. And Eric was a big fan of Michael Coney, interestingly enough, so we'll come back to that. And this is Starship Summer, a lovely title, and it's about a guy called David Conway who wants to get away from everything. And there's a kind of shared future in some of Eric's books, which is sort of rotates around a technology called telemass, which is a kind of matter transportation thing. And there's the telemass quartet, which PS did, which I read a few Christmases ago, 4 very light sort of chase romance novels, but great fun, great sort of diversion. If you just want something that's mind candy and fluff, but of a very high quality, really high quality, flavoured sort of thing. He's like a dessert. I would say Eric Brown is the dessert of science fiction. You know, it's like having a really fantastic gelato, you know, really high quality stuff. Pastel colours, wonderful. So anyway, this guy David Conway, he wants a quiet life, and he goes to this obscure planet called, what's it called? It's called Chalky Delta Pavonis 4, you know, which is typical sci-fi poetry. It's like Gay D Prime in Dune. I mean, that's my favourite thing in Dune, is the words Gay D Prime. And, you know, that's the sort of thing Adam Roberts talks about, the poetry of science fiction in the words. And he's got a derelict sort of starcraft, and he has it parked at a seaside location. And this is where the Michael Coney thing comes in, which is called Magenta Bay. Sounds great, doesn't it? And he falls in with a few other people. There's a woman who's a mudlark, or beachcomber as we used to say, and there's another guy who's kind of a layabout. And then he discovers that the spaceship is haunted by some sort of alien presence, and there's shades of Brian Stableford's Hooded Swan series there in that. And as I say, it's light, it's pastel coloured, it's dessert, it's cool on the tongue, and you know, just lovely stuff. And he was a massive fan of Coney, as I say, and he was a big Coney collector. And my friend Dorset Bob was always saying he was always trying to track things down through Bob and other dealers, obscure Coney works, which I've never seen, little chapbook novellas and what have you. And you know, and this is great. You know, Eric was good, and I say I wouldn't have read 8 books by him if he was that bad. He's not bad. He just wasn't massively ambitious in terms of world changing. He just wanted to write these fantastic narratives. There's a really good little sort of ghost story called Writer's Life, which is a bit like Christopher Priest, actually. That's a good one. And I do feel sorry he's gone, because he died recently. He was quite young. He used to review SF at The Guardian, and you know, it's a great shame. But this is lovely stuff to read in the summer. And you know, if you like these sort of short things like the Murderbot Diaries, they're that sort of length, you know, and they're just really good fun. They're not heavy on tech. There's collaborative novels with Keith Brooke, who I'm less keen on, but I need to read more of. But yeah, absolutely lovely. Starship Summer, and the title tells you everything. How romantic. So we're going to finish off now with another more contemporary book. This is a book I tried to read once and put down, and that was my bad, because I've picked it up again since, and I've decided that it's absolutely great fun. And I do want this in hardcover. It's quite hard to come by. I might have to get it from the States. Those peacocks. And I don't know, it might cost me quite a bit of money, but I'm quite keen to get one. And this is British Summertime by Paul Cornell. Now, Paul Cornell has written all sorts of things. He was writing some X-Men comics at one point, which I wasn't so keen on. He's also done Doctor Who stuff. And this came out in about 2000, and this is set in the city of Bath, where I live, which is not too far from here. Actually, where I am today is nearer to RAF Rudlow Manor, where they supposedly used to have the alien bodies, you know, the UK Area 51. There you go. So British Summertime, great title. When it came out, I thought, I love that title. I love this. It's Galax A format, as you can see. Nice A format paperback for those of you. That's a B format. I know I keep promising to do the formats video, so I must do one soon, and that's the A format. Bring back the A format, we love it, though it is more difficult to read if you're an old guy like me. And this is set in Bath. It's set round about the time it was written. It may be an alternate Bath, we'll see, but I'm rereading it at the moment and I'm loving it, because I put it down the first time and went back to it. And it's about two young women, one called Alison, who I would describe as a reader, and I don't mean of books. She can read people and places, and it has this sort of very British thing where she has the ability to always know where there'll be a chip shop. Not for definite, but she has a feel for where chip shops should be. And the way this is evoked by Cornell in the book is quite sort of funny, really, because it's just really about being observant and knowing where these sort of things pop up. And she has a friend called Fran who works in a bookshop in Bath, and it's quite good fun for me because it's set in places I know. And there are several sort of fantastic narratives set in Bath in recent years. Of course, there's Emma Newman's First Split Worlds book, and then of course there's The Sinister Booksellers of Bath by Garth Nix, both of which I covered briefly on the channel a while ago. This is actually much better, I feel, than the Nix, certainly. And Alison and Fran, they're these two female friends, and they always go to the pub and they have their boyfriends and they're drinking, and they do all the pubs which I go to or used to go to. So it's a very good nostalgia trip for me, and I can relate to it and what have you. So it is good stuff, and it was never a bestseller in Bath. It should have been, really. And it opens with Fran, the more flighty woman who works in a bookshop, having a ritual, doing a ritual on the hill in Bath Ford, which is just where the occupier lives. There's lots of music on the channel. Hey Phil. And she has little obsessions, and it references the bookshop as being a bookshop called Bilbo's. And I used to work in Bilbo's, and it's long gone, but the location's changed. And there's a few little things in this which are anomalous or incorrect, but you can tell that Cornell has spent some time in the city and loved it. So I don't know when that was. It must have been in the 90s, I guess. So these two young women, and it's got all sorts of things in it. There's these strange beings called the Golden Men. It does a Master and Margarita thing where a couple of chapters in it flips back to the time of Jesus and the disciples and a scene with Judas Iscariot, very Bulgakov. And there's a UFO crash. And basically Alison has this feeling, the reader, she has this sensation that the end of the world is coming and there's something bad's going to happen. And she lives in a grotty flat in Bath. And her friend Fran is very flighty, as I say, and Alison gets involved with a chap called Leighton, who is a pilot from the future, and he's very British, stiff upper lip, squadron leader Douglas Leighton, and he comes from a future. But which future is it? And these sort of coded references to Dan Dare from the Eagle comic, things like that. That's certainly the feel of it. And I say there's a UFO crash, and there are some parts which are really schlocky, but they're great and they weave together. There's angels, or are they angels? Are they demons? And it really comes together with all this wonderful melange of different things, and it's got the great feel of the magic and majesty of the city in the summer. And I'm kind of over Bath. I've lived there a long time, but my first few years were wonderful years for me, and the wonderful Golden Stone. I'll do a walk around one day so you can see more of it. There is bits on the channel, but British summertime, lots of ideas, strong messages about fundamentalism and religion, and just great fun entertainment. Maybe a little bit too padded in the way the books have got, but I am really enjoying reading it. And I don't know why I put it down the first time. Absolutely great stuff. So sometimes worth going back to things because it's not always about you or the books. You know, it's the mood. You know, things have to be right. They have to come together. Maybe I didn't read it in summertime, so that's it. So there's some SF to read in the summertime. If you want to particularly get a flavour of the British summer and British literary stylish SF, these are some of the greats. No women, I'm afraid. I do apologise for that. I think the reason is that I don't know why in Britain female SF writers don't concentrate on the landscape as much as male ones did, and nature writing is a big thing in Britain and there are more women coming into it. It's been a real renaissance for the last 10-15 years. There's almost too much of it, in fact, as I was saying to M. John Harrison when we did an interview recently. But you know, the land and the way it's changing is a big thing for the British because we have a small country. So I hope you've enjoyed that. This is Outlaw Bookseller. Going to finish my beer. Signing out for now. Bye.